I say thank you, but also there's a little bit of trepidation because I'm not an architect. If you know my work, I don't do urban design or architecture, but I have a different background that comes out of urban studies, urban theory, maybe spatial planning, community development. So I maybe will have a different take. And as I was listening to today, I was just thinking and pondering about, maybe some of the things I'm going to say might seem painfully obvious to people who work with materials, because that's really sort of what I'll be talking about. So I'd be interested to hear your reflections on whether these are different perspectives or takes on using objects and things. So anyhow, I'm a researcher here at UWI, and I guess lately I've been particularly interested in this idea of the more than human and the ways in which we can integrate objects and things and non-human entities into social research, which is really what I do. So that's really what the talk is about today, and I'll briefly discuss some of the thinking in my area, in my discipline, about working with the more than human in social research. And then what I'm going to do is outline some research that I've been working on for several years in Bristol, in a public space in the Bear Pit, which most of you will probably be familiar with. And then after that, I will talk about, in the Bear Pit, I'll talk about two specific objects, which cryptically I've referred to now as surface and structure. So that will hopefully become clear in the end. And in the end, I think I'll try and make some remarks about working with objects, if we're calling that design research or whatnot, in social research. So hopefully that's what I'll do. So turning to things that matter. So what I want to do is start with some introductory remarks really about the sort of state of play in my field in urban studies about thinking about objects and things, thinking about the more than human and materiality. And what's interesting, I think, is in this writing is almost you could describe as a type of anthropology of infrastructure, an anthropology of the built form, where the sights, the smells, the sounds of the urban environment become essential and are the real arbiters of human experience. So it's the infrastructure, it's buildings, it's the landscapes, it's really the conditions of the urban environment that provide the capacity for tolerance, for difference, for engagement and contact, and those are the things that I really want to, that inspire me, I want to draw out. So we see in this writing quite a bit of studies of anthropologies of infrastructure, studies of the smells of a particular place, and what that does to urban sociality and place experience. So that's sort of some of the thinking and theory that's sort of influenced my take on things and place. So again, what I'm going to, in this framing, you might have noticed, I don't know if the title was up there, but I talked about the sort of machines of public space. And I use this word machine in a very different way than you might normally expect. In this framing of the idea of machine, what I want to start to use the word machine to really encapsulate pretty much everything that exists. So if we start to think about the world as a machine and things that in it as machines coming together and connecting to making new connections or to be separate and disconnections, that's really how I'm using the term machine. I'll use that going forward here. So trees, numbers, ideas, plants, planning regulations, practices, people, these are all in my language machines. And this comes from a sort of object-oriented or thinking about the world in a sort of more than human way, which is what I want to do. So it sort of involves the development of a vocabulary that starts to move away from purely human-centered thinking about the urban and about social. So I'm not sure if this is going to be long or short, this talk, because I could speak for a long time, but I'm trying to be concise, so I'm probably going to speak too quickly. So this is the space where I work. Now, I think I've chosen these images, which are from the Bristol city website, the Know Your Place website. That has a fascinating resource. But anyhow, so these are some historic photos of the St. James Spartan roundabout, otherwise known as the Bear Pit to you and I today. So there it is, before the government building that was put up in the 50s and in the 60s, and there it is in its more sort of commonly known form after it was completed in the late 60s, I think. But you could see, I think what's important here is to think about the way the structure of the space, the physical built form of the space, is really always shifting. and always changing. This is a sort of restless space. So this is actually from 2011, and this again, it doesn't look like this anymore now. So this is already out of date, this image. So the place is constantly shifting and changing, and the makeup of it is contested, and what happens in this space is always sort of shifting. So I've had, for the last, I'd say, 4 or 5 years, I've followed and have stayed in contact with Henry Shafto, who many of you may know, hopefully, who used to work here at UWI and is retired and sort of living off in France somewhere, but he still sort of stays in touch with that. So he created a nice relationship with the bear pit and with people who were interested in it, and started this series of very small interventions to improve this in the public space. So I kind of see myself as sort of helping to keep, you know, Henry's work going and sort of stay in touch, connect UWI to the space. And what has that involved? So I guess I put this, I wasn't sure if I was going to put this, whether this was a useful slide or not, but I thought about the sort of things that people have been doing and producing and showing in their presentations about you know, things built, and so I think we mentioned earlier about writing and different ways of presenting your research. And I think my engagement with this space and with that sort of community over 5 years has involved a multitude of different kinds of approaches and involvements, and some small, very small research projects, mostly very small research projects or stuff I've just sort of done on my own. But mostly, I think, you know, so I work in the bear pit as sort of a volunteer. I've taken on a role as I'm a leader of a stream or a strand of activity in there called the play strand. So I'm involved in that, and I follow and engage with that. I support that activity in the space. So I'm embedded in the space as a participant. And I've written several papers that are sort of under development, and you know, been published in various places. So I've done the academic thing, and also I think the one I want to talk about a little bit is sort of some of these interventions, you know, which I think you might find interesting, are the ways in which we've introduced change into the space, which I'll talk about a bit. There's been lots of student projects in the bear pit that I've been involved in, and also one skateboard ledge has been constructed, which I'll also talk about a bit. So to talk about something about research, what this means as a research approach and a method. So, you know, as thinking about it as research, as design research, and as about a method, so I want to sort of draw out, so my overall approach is really thinking about these spaces and this idea as really uncovering or mapping that web of entities that exist in the space, and sort of identifying some of the connections and disconnections, whether they be from people, from discourse and language and regulations, from certain practices, objects, and things like that. So it's really trying to identify that sort of mesh. And a lot of that is about, and I use the language, you know, to go back to the machines, is introducing maybe a machine, a new connection, or severing a connection, and being experimental. So the image up here is one of our experiments where we introduced some colorful, this is about 2012, play blocks into the space to sort of see what would happen. And it turns out when you put colorful play blocks into public space, people do handstands. That's just what happens. I think that was his first handstand ever, you know, but, you know. So anyhow, so this is the sort of thing which we were sort of experimenting with in terms of making a playable space, being playful, and changing and challenging. I learned a tremendous amount from this sort of doing this type of intervention from a social research perspective. I worked with a designer maker called Will Dotson, who made the blocks, and actually, you know, we worked together in terms of thinking about the intervention. There's a nice history about what happened to the blocks as they go forward, but I'll save that for another time. Well, before I say something about surface, is what my research then, if I had to summarize what my sort of design research is, the methods of it. So we've heard about the approach. The methods, you know, I was writing up a list before. So it's this active involvement with the space. So I use the word with. So I work with the space, with the people who are in the space. I'm embedded in there. I give it my time. It goes over several years. There have been countless interviews, countless informal discussions, observation, film, photography, audio recording, observation, student projects I mentioned, archival research. So for me, getting to know the space is this sort of holistic approach to really understanding it and giving it my, doing a sort of, I guess, sort of more of an anthropology of the space than anything else, embedding myself in there as much as possible. So what I want to do with my sort of bit here is to talk about two machines, surface and structure, and how they have informed the nature of publicness. So this bit of talk that I'm giving sort of relates to, This bit of talk relates to a paper that's actually out for review. So be very interested in comments. It probably going to get heavily, critiqued as they do. But nevertheless, so there's a paper out that I'm thinking about some of these ideas about machines and about surfaces and so on. So this bit, I'm interested in the ways in which objects influence urban sociality, influence tolerance, change, generate publics, and I've referred to all of this as the idea of publicness. So when we go to a public space, what are the sort of accepted behaviors? What are the dispositions that are produced? And what is the role of objects and things in producing those and supporting those? What are the, and how do they change it? So this surface was built in 2000 and recently, I guess last year, started in the last couple of years. The city has redone the space, changed many aspects of it. And one major important bit was resurfacing the central bit. Now previously, the central bit of the bear pit was grooved and had sorts of cracks and changes of surface and little bits of brick here and there and so on. It was mostly, I guess, asphalt or tarmac, and wasn't really the greatest. It wasn't very colorful. So one of the changes that was put in place was these concrete pavers, which are interestingly called Schartz pavers. So so these are concrete pavers, but of course they changed the nature of, they've smoothed out the cracks and everything. But what's interesting is that immediately the space became more dominated or more interesting to skateboarders. So the surface summons a new public, the skateboarding public, that start to use the space. They see it, not only is it smooth, not only are the cracks gone, but I'm told that the Schartz pavers have pop. So I don't know if any of you are skateboarders, so they're poppy. This is what the skateboarders are telling me. So you can do tricks off of them nice and easy, much easier than you could off of tarmac. So it's the material components that are expressed in those pavers, which summon skateboarders. And really fascinatingly, skateboarders have this amazingly intricate understanding of urban space and materials. They go through the space with an eyes and a feel about where to go, where to skate. It's a really fascinating book by Ian Borden that talks about skateboarders and reflects on that sort of history and that sort of sensory knowledge. I have 2 minutes left, so I'll keep going. I'll give you the structure bit, the structural machine. So last summer, the Bear Pit Improvement Group sponsored a pavilion that was built by an arts group called Hand in Glove. And the pavilion was a sort of another sort of intervention into the space that sought to kind of bring color, bring change, bring challenge the sort of idea of the Bear Pit as a no-go, dangerous place. It sought to use those expressive qualities to think about what's happening. Very similar to I think what the play blocks did, but interestingly, this is a structure, covered structure in the Bear Pit in a space that's somewhat marginal, has an extensive amount of street drinking, homeless people there, so there's quite a bit of rough sleeping. So its physicality, its nature as a surface as a covered structure, again, summons a new and more intense public. When they were finishing building it, the artist, Philip Cheater, said 2 homeless gentlemen helped him finish it. They were like, this is fantastic. We're going to sleep here. We're going to stay here. This is our shelter. Immediately taking hold of it. Nevertheless, over this next few months, the place became, I saw it used as a play space for skateboarding, for hanging out, for street drinking, for fighting. It became known as a place with quite a bit of drug dealing and drug taking. When we go back there, you saw loads of course, cans of cider, as well as needles and so on. So it became a site of, as the police would call, antisocial behavior. Much of the contact and engagement that happened in this space around the structure became negative. So it became a space of conflict rather than contact and exchange. Eventually, the police decided, and there's a fantastic letter to the Bear Pit Improvement Group that says this structure is unreasonable. So, and it must come down. So, it's actually giving the structure agency. The structure is acting unreasonably. We must, either get it in line or, So it's really just fascinating. So, in each of those, in this moment, a public is put on display. In fact, I thought it is an amazing expression of austerity on display. It's essentially a display case of the problems and challenges facing homelessness, addiction, poverty, and so on. So not only is it a venue where publics can happen, but it's also becomes an object of public debate and discussion. So publicness is influenced by the nature of what happens in this space. It is now gone, it's been taken down. And there are also interesting conversations in the dismantling of the structure. So I will finish. My last slide is about how to make sense of these machines. I've only sort of introduced very briefly some of my thinking about how these interact with language, with vision plans, with policing tactics, and so on. But Levi Bryant will refer to these kinds of objects that summon new environments as bright objects. They capture other entities and other machines into their orbit. So a Chartres brick paver, concrete paver, is a bright object to skateboarders who understand how that will affect their enjoyment and participation in that space. This is unfortunate, you can't see this one, but there's nighttime. So once we built, this has gone on to be supported even further. So there's now a skateboard ledge in the Bear Pit, which is the skateboard community's absolutely gone mad about. So so it's quite interesting the way that public is now generating a new enthusiasm for the Bear Pit and sort of really making it their own. And there'll be new conflicts and contradictions in that space. So my final sort of word is about what if this is design research, I don't know, maybe you can tell me. So I think that these objects and these entities really are part of the arbiters about how we occupy, who can claim space, what happens in those spaces. So it's so centrally important about the role that these entities play in the makeup of our dispositions. What is unfortunate is so many of the contacts that happen in the Bear Pit tend to be negatively felt. And that is often because simply bashing difference together does not actually solve the problems of overcoming difference. But those connections need to be carefully made. So I think to say something about this as a research approach, I would say I'm trying to put objects front and center in my study and think about things that matter in a more sort of more than human way. So I'll finish with that.